Hello, Bernie. Today we want to talk about tailoring. It's our first podcast, and let me start with a kind of a provoking idea. I think it's not necessary to tell people why tailoring is necessary, because they should know. It's totally clear that not one project is like the other. Projects are unique, and for unique projects, of course, you need adjustments. But you think differently, as far as I understood, Bernie. Please let me know why you think it's necessary to talk about if if it's really necessary to discuss if tailoring is useful or not.
I think one of the problems, particularly with people starting off as project managers, is that if you give them a kind of methodology, then they feel, let's go on the safe side and do everything that's suggested. And I've seen several cases of project managers who just get lost in the mass of detail because they haven't tailored. And that's why I think it's a very important element to say, whatever you do in life, not just in projects, that you need to think about what is absolutely necessary and how you're going to cut it to size so that it suits the situation that you're in.
I'm I'm fully convinced of what you're saying, Bernie, but you're explaining now why it makes sense to tailor. My question was, does it make sense to tell people that it's necessary? Don't they really know? I don't think so, because they are doing that every time in their life. When they plan their kind of, I don't know, holidays, and they do it in the home country, they adjust the processes differently according to those when they would go abroad for, I don't know, getting a visa or something. I'm quite sure that they know already that we have to tailor. So why
Uh,
do you think those people you observed did everything?
I think it was basically, it's a harsh word, but insecurity. People, if people don't have a lot of experience, then they tend to err on the safe side. In which case, then they think, oh gosh, I've got 700 pages of Pinbook in front of me. Lots of really clever people have put their heads together and come up with these really good ideas. I can't go wrong by following what they have there. I think this is a basic misunderstanding very often of methodologies, is that people think that you have to take the whole package every time and get rather lost in it.
Okay, I can see your point. So for those not so experienced, it might be very useful. Okay, fine. Uh, let's then go over to the next step.
Mhm.
Assuming we have accepted that it makes sense to tailor and that we start to tailor. I personally think the first step is to think about if it's a complicated or a complex project. Why I'm saying this is because of this very famous Kinefin model, which is dividing into four areas of endeavors. But I would like only to focus on those two because this makes up the difference between a more predictive or a more iterative, let's say even agile approach. If it's a complex project, we should really deeply think about if it's really a good idea to go with a more um, with a more a phase-oriented approach. I would say it's better to go an agile way. And if it's a predictive, if it's more um, complicated than complex, then we should go, from my point of view, a more predictive and a more waterfall or phase-oriented approach.
Can I just interrupt there? I think maybe some of the people listening to this podcast aren't really clear about what the difference is between complicated and complex.
So let us know.
Okay. For me, complicated means several layers, maybe of similar things, but quite simply, it's multifaceted. So there are several aspects to it, But if I can isolate each of those aspects, they're fairly straightforward. So I'm talking about multiple aspects rather than something simple.
Okay, let me add another element where I think it's very important. It's about foreseeing causes and effects based on the causes.
Mhm.
So if you think about engineering projects, if you think about, I don't know, building a house, if it's a skyscraper, or building a house, if it's your own house for living in, for your family, the principle behind are the same. Of course, it's much more complicated to do a skyscraper, but but all the physical laws which are behind, they stay the same.
Mhm.
Yeah, so therefore, this is a complicated project because you can foresee the causes and what the effects of several causes are. In a non, let's say, in a non-complicated, in a complex world, there are so many interactions between all those factors that you cannot foresee. Yeah, there is no longer a kind of overseeable number of cause and effects.
Mhm.
And therefore, agile approaches are, especially for those kind of ideas, they are very, very useful.
That sounds very much as if you associate risk, level of risk, with the approach. Is that true?
That's absolutely the point. A lot of those agilist people say, and I agree at least up to a certain degree, say that Scrum or other methodologies in agile software development could be also seen as risk management methodologies,
Mhm.
or a way to get risk under control. So more or less, they say doing agile is already risk management.
Mhm.
We can
So,
discuss if this is true, but for the purpose, I opened the discussion on complex versus complicated. That does not play a big role. But if you know it's complex, you should really think about agile approaches.
okay, so here you're saying basically one aspect of tailoring is quite simply what kind of approach should we use? Should we use a more conventional predictive approach under certain circumstances, and otherwise, particularly if the risk is high, it's more unpredictable, then we would tend to use the agile approach, correct?
Absolutely, as you said. If I can foresee cause and if I see a cause and I can foresee the effect, of course, this is already predictive. Yeah, so even the word predictive um, more or less shows that the complicated approach, or the approach which is related to complicated, is the right one. The wording itself is already saying it.
Mhm.
But of course, this is maybe just a starting point, a very important starting point, because there you're deciding on really which way to go. But beside that, there might be additional factors, Bernie.
Yeah. Well, I think one of them that is very often related between the simple and complicated is size. It's a different, you talked about construction industry, and there's a big difference between building a small shed and building a whole row of houses in the same street, for example, where we get into a more complicated area. And then if you're going to, instead of building houses, skyscrapers, as you said, size has a lot to do with it, because almost automatically with size, then the level of risk increases too. Even if you're going to take a predictive approach on a large project, then you've got to consider too about the levels of documentation that you feel will be necessary. If you're under huge time pressure and it's a relatively small project, then it's going to be quite likely that you're going to cut your cloth accordingly. In other words, maybe less less comprehensive documentation, that maybe some of the various methodologies that might be available for ascertaining and describing the requirements would not be as necessary just to get the results fast enough under those circumstances.
Sorry to interrupt you, but let me make a remark here because it might be very important for those listening to us. It's from my point of view, it's very important to make clear that size is not the same as much money. So a lot of money has nothing, not necessarily, I wouldn't say nothing, but not necessarily something to do with size. Yeah. But if you use the term size, or you have used the term size, Bernie, what is size for you then?
Almost automatically duration, but very often you have geographic aspects. It might not just be in one locality, but in several. The number of people involved in that project too, because automatically the amount of communication that is necessary, the number of stakeholders that you have to relate to increases almost exponentially with the size increasing of the project.
Okay, size has many aspects, obviously, and you break them down already. You talk about geographically distributed projects, you talk about the duration of projects, the number of people working for projects. There is a very famous project mentioned in the Bible. It's about a tower. And one of the problems there was that a lot of people speaking different languages, and this should be, or that's as far as I understood that's one of the reasons why this project failed. Yeah, but maybe not the only one. But therefore, of course, size plays a big role. Size for me is a kind of a synonym for those aspects you already mentioned, Bernie. So it's about different language, it's about different culture, and it's important to say, from my point of view, that different culture does not only mean Asia versus Europe or the US. That different cultures could be, and it is not only could be, you will find them between companies in the same country. Yeah, so culture, of course, seems to be, for me, is a very important factor that you should take into consideration when you think about tailoring. Another one I want to bring into the game is the maturity of the organization you're working for. Do you have examples where something went wrong? I don't know, but I'm sure you have one.
You weren't thinking of Berlin Airport again, were you? No.
Yeah, for example, yeah, could be a good example to show what might happen if people doing the project do not speak the same language than those who ordered the project, whatever that means, speaking the same language.
Yeah. I would like to talk a bit about the cultures within an organization, because projects are automatically linked with change management, and that change, careful, this word change management has two meanings in project management. It means, on the one hand, how you control your change requests, but it also has to do with how do you transition from one state to another. And it's not just when you move from predictive to agile methodologies that you have a transformation or a change issue to deal with. And that's a lot to do with culture. And if you're going through a project that tries to change the way of working, that is very often a challenge to the existing culture. That will automatically mean that you're going to have to invest far more time in communication, in stakeholder management, just to convince people that the change is the right thing. And yes, I've seen many cases where organizations, some of my customers in the past, had tried to push through a change without addressing that sufficiently. The poor project manager, wasn't always me, was very often frustrated because he couldn't spend enough time on the change management issues that will be there. And that would be normally part of the tailoring. I don't know how many proposals I was part of where the suggestion in the proposal was we need to include a large number of activities precisely for the transition, for the change management, where our client turned those down and says, oh, you don't need to do this, we'll attend to it. And what finally happened was that nothing was done at all. So I think this is a pretty vital issue, indirectly connected also with tailoring.
Okay, Bernie, before we go over to the point, how experienced project managers like you might approach tailoring. So if there is a special order or of steps you do, I would discuss with you another point before. From my experience from the PMP preparation courses, very often people do not really have a good understanding or a feeling or um, what does it mean to tailor, especially when it's about cost. I don't know why, but typically they say to me something like, I do not know what you're talking about tailoring in cost. Because what you have to do in cost is very easy. You have to find out how much it costs and you have to keep everything according to the budget. And as long as you do that, everything is fine. So what can you tailor in terms of cost? And I'm always making the same example. And the example is that your project has to cover two different currencies.
Mm-hmm.
That changes the world in cost management.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because you have to think about conversion rates, you have to think about how often to change them. Do you take the one from the last year? Do you change them every minute, every day, if once a week? What happens if the currency, the exchange rate changes over time? Who has to take the cost for those? Or who earns the money if it's going into that in the other direction? These are very typical example in terms of cost. Do you have more examples, not only maybe for cost, where you think it might not be totally clear what it means to customize or to tailor there in special knowledge areas?
Yeah, but I would like to stay with cost to start off with. In the book, we mention EDA kosten, there anyway costs. And I have had many experiences where, for several clients, it's not clear that there is a very stark difference between tracking the cost of external consultants who are working, or just contractors working on the projects, and internal staff. And it's very often very difficult to make transparent what the actual costs of internal staff are, both in terms of cash, because if anybody is working on a project, then they're not available in whatever position they normally have in operations. So they are costing the company money that way. But this wonderful expression that they're there anyway, they're not part of our budget. There's very often the question is, do we track people's effort, the number of hours that they spend on the project? In some countries, like Germany, for example, you have very strict labor regulations so that a level of anonymity is expected. You're not expected to be able to allocate particular hours to a particular person internally, although all the externals have to be calculated down to the last minute almost. So it's difficult sometimes for a project manager to show exactly what the level of effort is from the client's internal staff, which I think is a pretty vital element because A, it's the basis of lots of discussions, if not arguments, about how available internal staff will be for a certain project. Secondly, because of this conflict, a lot of internal staff are very often torn between loyalty to their internal operational responsibilities and helping on the project to get a good result there too. And I often found myself then in a dilemma: is how transparent do I make this? just to try and free up the people so that they're not expected to work double time because they're in a project as well as the internal operations.
Okay, I think there was also a very interesting and a very important factor in there. Any restrictions to, I don't know, legal or internal rules of organizations. Of course, this might change a lot regarding tailoring too. Yeah, absolutely. And I would add one last one where I think that makes a huge difference before we then can go over to the question how we should do it, or what is the process, or what is the way we can get to. And this is the contractual situation. We both worked for a consulting company, Bernie, and you might remember that in those kind of relationships, the world is different compared to working internally for the same company. And especially and we talk about this in our book in procurement, in the chapter about procurement. Again, it makes a huge difference if the contract we are following is a time and material or a fixed price contract. And this changes a lot on both sides, on the side of the project and on the side of those who are delivering something for the project. Yeah. So, okay, but
I
yes,
do
please
have
go
one
on.
thing. I think one of the things that puzzles people when they start off with the PMBOK mindset, if you like, is the fact that virtually every knowledge area has a separate process for planning. And this is very often in the early stages confused with actually doing the work and planning your schedule in the sense of making a schedule. And I've really come to appreciate this basic idea within the PMBOK is that before you start organizing other people, namely your team's work, you should think about yourself and the way that you're going to work. And within this, plan your schedule management, plan your procurement or whatever. That's a very strong element for me in the aspect of tailoring. If we go to something as straightforward, you might think, as in scheduling, you again have the whole issue of how detailed, can I plan the schedule? Can I break it down to anything smaller than individual days? Or can I do half days? Or maybe even less than that? It's also linked with the cost aspect as well. There's a question to do, again, with the availability of internal staff, but also the external staff. Is it part of the culture of the company that I'm working within to do anything like that? Not just because of any labor legislation that might be there, but quite simply is the culture. There might be a general culture is we assign lots of responsibility to our employees, which means that we do not want to track, we do not expect them to write down what they did every hour of every day of their work. That's a huge element of tailoring, whether you can
Yes,
find that
absolutely.
level.
Bernie, but now you opened the door we haven't talked about before, but maybe we should go through. I like the idea. You're talking about what, more or less at the moment, you talked about what the PMBOK is calling integration management. Do you think integration management and tailoring is the same?
Oh, that's an interesting aspect. My understanding of integration management is that it's the basics. Basically, you could do any project you like with integration management, and a lot of the other stuff are looking at integration management in greater detail. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. But no, I agree. I agree.
Okay.
What I thought about the second was the project management plan. The project management plan is the all over of all detailed plans, and detailed plans here means including how it's done, and how it's done is tailoring. So maybe not the whole integration management is related to tailoring, but develop the project management plan is pure tailoring.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But the whole issue around integration management, that's again, an issue that puzzles some people when they start off with the PIM book way of looking at things. All of the major central deliverables that a project manager produces are within integration management. And it starts off with your project charter, your project management plan. These are the things precisely that you need. Why do you have integrated change control? Because you've got so many different aspects that you have to consider at the same time. And if you don't have it centralized, so to speak, within integration management, you might forget important issues to do with quality or with the cost of the change and so forth.
Including all these bloody deliverables. Okay, Bernie. Let us now go over maybe to the last step, or to the last topic we should discuss, or we might discuss here. And the question is, and this might be not, especially for not so much experienced project managers, it might help them to get a better understanding, to get to the point, to have something like a tailoring. So is there a certain way you follow? Of course, we talked about this up front, and you made some comments on it, but please explain the way you think about tailoring and the steps you take.
Okay. At the beginning, I think I mentioned it, that tailoring has to do basically with two levels. It's a selection of which of the processes that are described in the PIM book am I actually going to perform? Or rather, the other way around, can I actually leave out? And secondly, the question of how deeply do I go into each of those processes? And for both of those aspects, then as a project manager working within a certain organization, you've always got to consider, number one is any legislation, any regulations that govern that industry. So we're talking about EEFs. Secondly, you have to think about that organization's own organizational view. There are lots of regulations within the insurance industry, within the financial services industry in general, but all others, where you are expected, whatever project you do, to include certain documentation, to take certain steps. The vast majority of my clients in the last 20 plus years have all had their own particular life cycle model for their projects. And very often there are steps that you have to apply depending on such things as size, the financial investment that's necessary for those as well. And what a number of those, I can think in particular of one insurance company I worked a lot with, but they're not the only ones who did it, where as a project manager, if you leave something out, you have to justify it and say, okay, why is it not necessary under these circumstances? So that's something to start off with. Then you've got to consider the kind of deliverables that you're going to produce, the end product, and what quality expectations your organization has. Quality in both the sense of how you're going to measure the quality of the deliverables, but also how you're going to check on the quality of how you work, the way that you actually perform the various processes in that project. So we've got legislation, internal regulations and standards. Those standards, by the way, have a very strong importance for anybody who wants to learn from your projects or do maintenance on your projects in the past. Thirdly, we had the element of quality standards that you have to consider. And then we would move on to areas to do with the team, for example, and what can I actually do with my team? Have we tried certain approaches or not? How experienced are they? How experienced am I even? So I would see those as the starting off points, at least, in deciding what I'm going to modify in my approach. But then you're going to have to look at where it's relevant. In some cases, you might find that procurement can just simply be left out because you don't have to purchase anything to perform your project. In a simple internal project, that will often not be the case. In other areas, people like to joke about quality standards in IT projects. The question there too is, how much are you going to look after quality in those areas? In manufacturing, for example, I've worked quite a bit with automotive clients. There you have a lot of very, very strict regulation on what kind of quality control documents you must produce and your various subcontractors have to produce. So all of that part will be part of the tailoring considerations you have too. I'm sure you've got something to add to that.
Yes, definitely. I think it's very interesting that you brought up those different frameworks they have in the different companies. My view is the bigger the company, the more they have it, and they also divide between. Let's go back to the term of size of the project. Size, once again, is not meant only money. We discussed that already. So they have even models, or they have kind of classifications around where they decide if something is an A, B, C, or whatever the naming of those categories are. And depending on the category, much more documentation or much more rules to follow are provided or necessary, and you don't have a choice to do it. Or as you said, in some cases you might have a very, very good argumentation why you're not doing it.
And that, and don't forget governance, the amount of control that your internal organization wants to have. That, though, in my experience, is nearly always linked to the size of the budget.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And this, of course, has something to do with the risk for the organization which is behind, and laws, etc., etc. Yeah, definitely. Bernie, what do you think? Are you confident with this podcast? Do you have an idea? Do you think people could understand and get a better understanding on what it is about, why we do it, how to do it? Something to add? Something missing?
So my feeling, I think we've covered the basics. I mean, we want to talk about the differences between agile and predictive approaches in a different podcast anyway, which is a really important aspect that we just touched on at the beginning. But I would like to put an appeal into this podcast, namely, if anyone feels that we've left out a really important part, that we get some kind of feedback from them.
And there is a feedback form on the website for this. Yeah, it's found under, believe it or not, menu titled feedback.
That was very original of you.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Okay, Bernie. So thank you so much for that discussion. And there will be more than those. And you mentioned already one. Yeah. So up to the next time.
Okay. Thank you.